Thank you for having me, scholars, and I want to apologize in advance. I'm pretty terribly sick, so I apologize for my voice and any coughing that I might do. I'd like to talk with you today about Bhagat Singh Thind and two visits that he made to the city of Omaha, Nebraska, and I have dug very deeply into his time in Omaha, Nebraska, and I find it, believe it or not, to be very significant source to understanding not just Thind as a person, the relationships that he had in the United States, but also to illuminate underlying themes to what Thind is most known for, which is his battles to become an American citizen. So for a brief review, Bhagat Singh Thind comes to the United States in 1913 from Punjab, just outside Amritsar. He enrolls at UC Berkeley. He works in the lumber mills of the Pacific Northwest in the summer. At the outbreak of World War I, he enlists in the United States Army, and then in 1918 in Washington State, he applies for and receives American citizenship, and he gets that taken away only a few days later from the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The following year, he goes down to Portland, Oregon. He reapplies for citizenship. He gains it, and then the exact same INS agent appeals, and then his citizenship case is brought up to the district court in San Francisco, and eventually it makes its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, where it's heard in late 1922, and then the decision is given in early 1923. We're actually about 2 days away from February 19th, the anniversary of when that decision is given. What's less known about Bhagat Singh Thind is that the following year, in 1924, he begins a career as a metaphysical lecturer and traveling spiritual teacher and author, and he does this for well over 40 years. This is the majority of his life. He ultimately receives citizenship on the third attempt in 1936. A special act is passed that allows for any veteran of the First World War to become a naturalized American, and so that's how he ultimately becomes a U.S. citizen. So our common understanding, if we know anything about Bhagat Singh Thind, we know about his case in front of the Supreme Court, United States versus Thind, and it's commonly understood as an act of racial exclusion. Since Thind is not a, quote, free white person, under the law he is not allowed to naturalize. And this is seen as an act of exclusion. Thind is kept outside the rights of a citizen. It's actually much more complicated than that. Thind's case doesn't argue against the racial categorizations of the time. Thind does not argue against racism itself. In fact, he argues for inclusion as a white person. And he does so in a very clear way that also has a very strong element of anti-blackness within it. Thind claims that he is not only of Aryan descent, and he should qualify as a Caucasian and therefore as white. He argues that he is racially pure. And he takes it further and he says that the caste system in northern India has kept his Aryan blood pure in the same way that segregation in the United States has kept the races separate and pure. He takes it another step further where he argues that he would be just as repulsed at the prospect of marrying and conceiving children with a dark-skinned woman from southern India as a white American would to do the same with an African American. This makes us, I would assume in 2018, a little bit uncomfortable. The recent cinematic treatment of Bhagat Singh Thind's fight for citizenship took amazing narrative liberties, and I'd like to imagine Thind as being forced by his attorney to take this route, ultimately having to be kind of dragged into it. And there's a reason why this is such an awkward thing, because it is something that has been embraced for a long time by the alt-right. Kind of a very awkward juxtaposition, but David Duke, perhaps the most famous and prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan in the last 50 years, in his memoir, he comes at his racist epiphany. He dedicates himself to the racist cause in India. And the way that he describes this epiphany, it's almost interchangeable with the racial thinking that Thind puts forward in his fight for citizenship. There are a lot of questions about this. As we saw in the brief movie, many people don't want to believe that this was his strategy. Other scholars are left confused. You know, the Supreme Court is this kind of grand venue to make a large moral stand. Why didn't Thind? I think Omaha, Nebraska reveals some clues. As a traveling lecturer, Thind goes to Omaha in 1926. And while he's there, setting up to lecture and give classes, he has an awkward reunion with his first wife. The year after the Supreme Court decision, Thind marries a woman, Inez Bullen, and they seem to have a very short and rocky marriage. They separate after not too long. Bullen apparently hears through the grapevine that Thind is in Omaha, so she rushes up to the city afraid of what he's going to say about her. Their spat is covered by a local reporter who dutifully prints both sides of their dispute. And the quote that comes from Thind is very revealing. He essentially reaffirms his claims to whiteness and purity that he does before the courts. Quote, "I am white," he said. "I am Hindu of high caste and told her so before we married. I was a naturalized American citizen once, but the United States Supreme Court revoked my citizenship on grounds that I was an Asiatic. It was not because my blood is not white." To go back to Thind's legal struggles for citizenship, a recent idea has been put forth by the scholar Doug Colson, who says that if we go back to Thind's attempts for citizenship in the state of Oregon, this is Judge Wolverton who decides in that case, Colson thinks that Thind's connections to the Ghadar Party are much more significant. Judge Wolverton at length talks about Thind's connection to people such as Bhagwan Singh Gyanee, the fact that Thind visited Gyanee when he was in prison after the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. He talks about Thind being an active member of the Ghadar Party, but then he dials it back and he says, but it seems that Thind is a patriotic American now. I've gotten letters in support of his character in person, so I'm going to let this Ghadar stuff slide. Colson speculates that by the time of the Supreme Court decision, it is much more charged to be perceived as a foreign extremist. A series of things happen in the interim, not just the echoes of the Hindu-German conspiracy trial, but we have the Palmer raids, the 1918 Alien Act, we have the first Red Scare, we have Lothrop's daughter with his The Rising Tide of Color, the threat against white world supremacy, where he mentions specifically Hindu extremists. So Colson is going to say that by the time that Thind's case comes to the Supreme Court, while Justice Sutherland, who renders the decision, doesn't mention it openly, that this is an undeniable subtext to the decision, that this probably swayed Sutherland and the court to decide in the way that they did. I would also suggest that there is perhaps another element going on in the Supreme Court decision. The decision itself is very confusing. It's conflicted, it's contradictory. The court actually contradicts itself from only a few months earlier in another racial eligibility case. I would argue that while race is talked about, another main factor in the decision was Thind's appearance, visible appearance as a Sikh. When you go through the decision, there's an inordinate focus on visual recognition. There are phrases such as familiar observation and readily distinguishable, and this quote from Justice George Sutherland, where he says, "The children of English, French, German, Italian, Scandinavian, and other European parentage quickly merge into the mass of our population and lose the distinctive hallmarks of their European origin." These are photos taken at Ellis Island around the turn of the century. I think this is what Sutherland is referring to. He contrasts them with what were known as, at the time, as Hindu immigrants. It is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from the various groups of persons in this country commonly recognized as white. And then we have the previous quote. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the children born in this country of Hindu parents would retain indefinitely the clear evidence of their ancestry. If we go back in time and imagine ourselves having the perspective that the court did at this time, Hindu was not a religious term, it was a geographical and often a racialized term, meaning anyone from India. And since the vast majority of immigrants from India during this time were Sikh men from the Punjab, when the phrase Hindu immigration was used, either in print or visually in photographs, this is the image that would be conjured up. So I think that Thind's appearance as a Sikh would have been ready at hand for Sutherland and the other justices. And ironically, so many of Thind's attempts to come across as a perfect case of assimilation may have backfired against him. Sutherland may have looked at Thind and said, even with language and education and military service, you're still going to retain these hallmarks. You will never be assimilable. These two factors, and this is a piece from 1910, which is one of the phrases of the time, Hindu immigration from India was often referred to as the tide of turbans. I think these two factors, association with the Ghadar Party and Thind's visual appearance as a Sikh, they also come into play in perhaps one of the most bizarre spells of his life and a period of his life that has been forgotten until now. In 1942, Thind returns to Omaha, Nebraska to lecture. And this is what lecturers like him would often do. They would go in a circuit visiting the same cities time and again. Thind sets up at the Rome Hotel, which you can see on the right-hand side. And within 2 days, he is arrested on charges of operating as a spiritualist, or someone who communicates with the dead. Spiritualists during this time often told fortunes, and ordinances against spiritualists were often anti-fraud and anti-fortune-telling ordinances. So why was Thind arrested as a spiritualist and promptly thrown in prison where he faced a 90-day jail sentence and was humiliated both in court and in the court of public opinion? This is a rushed newspaper article from the local Omaha paper, relishing in the fact that Thind, a vegetarian, is forced to eat bologna sandwiches and mush, and that he has to use a towel to cover his hair instead of a turban cloth. The most obvious explanation is that it is a case of bad luck. Thind comes to the city in the immediate wake of a scandal involving a trio of out-of-state spiritualists led by the Reverend Lulu Tabor. Tabor and company set up shop at a local hotel, and they made a fortune having the wives and girlfriends and family of American soldiers who were stationed abroad consult with them to communicate with their departed loved ones or to find out if their loved ones were still alive. Tabor was really shrewd, and she said, I can only communicate with the dead, so if I can't relay messages from your beloved, they're probably still alive, and you don't have a reason to worry. Also, less than 2 years earlier, a man named Muhammad Ashraf, who claimed to be a Hindu psychic, he came through town telling fortunes with a crystal ball in a local department store. He also came in tow with 2 young white women who authorities determined he was trafficking. And so he was arrested and then summarily deported on charges of violating the Mann Act. But also Thind's appearance would have made him readily suspect for these things. Not only was the turbaned man the most common image for immigration from India, but it was used excessively by people involved in magic and spiritualism and fortune-telling to the point where the two became synonymous. Sikh men were often assumed to be spiritualists and fortune-tellers, which may seem absurd now, but it has a long-running history, and as Thind's case shows, has very dire consequences. It's a reason why a joke such as this falls so flat, because it's tying into a very long-running, painful stereotype. Thind believed that he was being confused with the spiritualists who preceded him. He also believed that there was another factor at play. He said in court that he believed that the British were behind his arrest in Nebraska. This was used in court and by the local newspapers to paint Thind as some sort of paranoid hothead who believed that everyone was out to get him. But I think Thind might have known more than almost anyone else on American soil how true that possibility could be. Thind's son, David, has remarkably pulled together British intelligence files on his father and made them available. And it's clear that Thind was being monitored at that point for almost 3 decades. There are records of men watching Thind's lectures, of taking pamphlets for his talks and sending them back to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., and along to higher-up authorities in England. Thind himself believed that the British were behind his loss in the Supreme Court, and he blamed them well through the 1930s. And as perhaps not a coincidence, in 1926, when Thind was quarreling with his ex-wife in Omaha, this is very blurry and I'm sorry, there were British agents who were sitting in on his lectures and mailing copies of the pamphlets from his Omaha talks back to headquarters. Who gets Thind out of prison? Ironically, it's the same member of the Ghadar Party that throws his case for citizenship in doubt back in 1918. It's Bhagwan Singh Gyanee. Just as Thind visits Gyanee in McNeil Island after the Hindu-German conspiracy case, Thind writes to Gyanee in prison. Gyanee sends money to Thind's family in Los Angeles to help keep them afloat. Gyanee calls Thind in prison and cheers him up. More importantly, Gyanee comes up with a plan to get Thind out of prison. Instead of registering as a spiritualist minister like the local authorities wanted him to, Thind registers as a Sikh minister, something that was much truer to his beliefs and something that he could abide by. It says a lot about Thind that he would sit in jail for 90 days rather than just sign a perfunctory ministerial form for something that he was not and did not believe in. There was also another factor. After a few days in jail, it became readily apparent that Omaha authorities had put the wrong person in prison. Letters began to flood into the local newspapers of people testifying to Thind's character and person, and I think the authorities really just wanted a quick way out of the situation. Thind is released from prison, and the very next day he puts a new display ad in the local paper, and he begins his series of lectures all over again. He writes to Gyanee proudly and says, quote, "Tomorrow I start again." Thind makes no money in Omaha. In fact, he's running things at a loss, but he does it just out of principle, and I would say out of defiance against the people who tried to stop him. After he's done with his lectures in Omaha, he goes to Denver, where he's reunited with Bhagwan Singh Gyanee. And this photograph is kind of preserves that moment in time when these two men who had known each other for decades and who were there for each other in prison, that moment is marked. And this backstory was unknown. It was just a neat photograph that Sada had up on its website. To know the background of it, I think, makes it much more poignant. So rather than these perhaps problematic portraits of Thind in Omaha, I'd like to leave you with one final portrait of Thind in Omaha, Nebraska. After his arrest in Nebraska, Thind doesn't return to the city. He continues as a lecturer for another quarter of a century, and he constantly returns to the cities that he had previously visited, but he never returns to Omaha, I think for good reason. In the early 1950s, the city has its centenary celebrations, and there's all sorts of events that go on. One of them was a special memorial exhibition of 36 portraits by the recently deceased Omaha resident, John Laurie Wallace, who is this very talented artist who is this pillar of the Omaha arts community. And perhaps the greatest honor that was bestowed during all of this was a man from the Smithsonian came looking at some of Wallace's portraits, and he looked at a select few that he wanted to take and put in the Smithsonian's collection, a very rare and distinguished honor. The same newspaper that relished in Thind wearing overalls in prison and eating bologna sandwiches ran a photograph of this man from the Smithsonian admiring the portraits of Wallace. And this was one of them. It was Bhagat Singh Thind. In 1926, when Thind's ex-wife shows up in town, when British agents are monitoring his lectures, Thind sat for a portrait to be done by Wallace. It was one of Wallace's favorite portraits that he ever did. His personal secretary said that he would never part with it, and it was the central pillar of Wallace's career as a painter. He showed it in New York, in Philadelphia, in Omaha, and in California, and it received praise from critics in America and as far away as France. And today the portrait of Thind is part of the Jocelyn Museum in Omaha's permanent collection and part of a memorial to Wallace, and it is about a mile away from the hotel where Thind was first arrested on charges of operating as a spiritualist. Thank you.